Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to you all, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this FS Club webinar. Climate Emergency, Catastrophe, How Bad Is It? Presented by Aubrey Meyer. My name is Ian Aitchison. As the son of a Scottish farmer, I was born into climate issues, rain especially, and I have an appreciation for how precious our soil is and for sustaining life on Earth for over half a century. However, as someone now involved in the decarbonisation of marine fuels, I'm especially interested in Aubrey's presentation. So it's a great pleasure to be asked back and to chair this event today. But I can only do so thanks to the generosity of sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. But before I get out of the way as quickly as possible and hand over to our speaker, some housekeeping notes. The slides are available to download in the chat and on the website. This is normal procedure for FS Club webinars, but will be especially useful today, given the complexity of the presentation material, the excellent material that we've got from Aubrey to look forward to. We'll be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after Aubrey's presentation, so make sure you go to the GoToWebinar chat facility, which I can see on my right here, to send your questions into me, and I'll feed them into the conversation. So now to our speaker, Aubrey Meyer, director and co-founder of the Global Commons Institute in 1990. As a professional violinist, Aubrey has long recognized nature is music and has been a campaigner for carbon reduction for 30 years. His contraction and convergence model was on the agenda at COP3 in Kyoto in 1997 and has been much praised for being simple, international, and one which facilitates economic progress. But rather than a market-based framework, we're looking at a climate-based framework for the market. And so, to let us know just how bad the climate emergency really is, Aubrey, the floor is yours.
Oops. Share my screen. Well, hello to anyone and to everyone who's here. I'm very happy to be able to express this to you with you understanding that although I've been involved in climate change campaigning and so on for 30 years, I've been a musician for 65 of the last years. I was born in 1947. So a well-tempered global climate accord is really another way, a musician's way of saying contraction and convergence is like music. It not only brings everybody together, but it does it in a way where playing music in all keys equally, at whatever rates it is played, are possible. And that's because of one very simple thing. In well-tempered music, all the semitones within the octave, there are 12 of them, are tuned to be precisely equal. So that is a bit of blur, but the animation that you're going to see in a moment explains a very simple but a very, very important point. As Ian said, simple international economics enabling is actually how Mike Manelli, the chairman of ZN, described it. That's spot on. Before we go to the well-tempered stuff, let's just look at where we came from. This data behind these slides, this is per capita averages from 1750 until the present time, show the UK started in 1750, the US started in 1850, China and India effectively only started in 1950. And most countries are still below the global per capita average. Certainly the UK is starting gradually to approach it. In fact, they're about equal to China. But you get to this point in the total emissions of all countries with LUC at the top is land use change. They're all the per capita emissions. And the challenge now is how do you get everybody to get to zero by 2040? There's your global per capita average. The past has been expansion and divergence. The future is obviously contraction and convergence. So we reach by 2040 zero for everybody. The key difference is entitlements are not the same as emissions. And here you have what's left, alternating between pro rata and per capita. It's really that simple. It'll do it a couple of times and then we'll move on. This proposal suggests a global carbon incentive fund that makes it possible. This is a potted history of everything. It's a big poster at COP26. It's got 3 panels. Let's just look at them in detail. That's what originally went down at COP2 in 1996. There's a wonderful story about all of that. That's what happened since 1990 when the convention was signed. In spite of everybody agreeing because CNC was needed by definition, emissions have continued to grow and consequently concentrations have risen and temperature has risen. And now the argument is essentially how quickly can we get to net zero globally, and is a mechanism required, a unifying mechanism required to do that? And my answer is that's a well-tempered climate accord as the basis of that. And panel 3 comes up here. It's simply rising temperatures, you will see in a minute, at the official rates goes up here. That's without feedback effects. That's with feedback effects. You'll see that's a very significant difference. And it's when essentially feedbacks start reinforcing each other in the wrong direction that the planet warms. Feedback looping, excluded and included. So, keep losing the mouse here. Where's it gone? There it is. Moving on. Just before we go there, work from the scientific community proceeded almost immediately, but from 2010, the UKMO took a leading role in plotting the future forward for the 5th assessment of IPCC published in 2014. We said to them, you must be sure that you include feedback effects, but particularly from the Arctic. They assured us that all the relevant feedbacks are in the model. There it was, HADCRUT 4.1. They admitted finally in 2021 that actually they hadn't used HADCRUT 5, which they did now, which accepted that the temperature rise is significantly more than was projected by 4.1. So the whole of the 5th assessment was basically propagated on the expectation of temperatures globally following that kind of an average. Obviously, that's not what happened. Here's data from GISS from 1960 to 2020, the same period. The global average is there dotted in green, but on land it was above. The ocean was below. The average is a sort of mixing of the two, but the Arctic has accelerated at twice the rate. The warming in the Arctic has accelerated at twice the rate of the global average. And here's a NASA video to actually give you a little visual of that. It's very quick. You can see quite clearly that as time progresses, the red is very strongly concentrated in Siberia. And to make matters worse, this has triggered something called the Rossby wave function, which is basically a jet stream, which normally goes like a hula hoop. Now it's started to go up and down while it's going around. And the animation, it's a very clever animation from the people at the web link here, looks like this. When it dips low from the north, it's cold, but when it dips high from the south, it's hot. So you simultaneously have both these things like fires in Western Canada and cold snaps, even snow in Texas simultaneously. This is one of the effects of feedback behavior, but the disproportionate effect of the Arctic feedback. So that was a big issue. And try and go on. Here's IPCC AR number 6. They still proceed in this scientific manner of assessing probabilities. You can see them going across there for the 3 temperatures. I don't know why I'm having such difficulty with this now. For 1.5, 1.7, and 2 degrees, 17, 33, 50%, 67%, 83% probability. They say if you have a 900 gigaton budget of CO2, of carbon from CO2, that is, no, sorry, that's from CO2 itself. It gives you a 17% probability, they say, of 1.5, but an 83% probability of 2. And that's the table where it's all shown. However, since then, all the work that was done for AR6 was in these so-called SSP scenarios. There were 4 of them, 5 of them in fact. The other 3 are completely out of sight. They're much higher. The only one that is vaguely relevant to the Paris goal of being 0 by 2050 is SSP1. You can ask why all the rest were actually done, but that's the way of the world. Now, the IMF have been aware of this obviously for a long time, and they've now picked up on the issue of what are called Fattail risks, which means that a high impact event is possible, but it has a low probability. But in light of what you're about to see, you'll know why others are now saying high impact and increasing probability, not low probability, but increasing probability, because of the continuing political arguments about how bad it is, whose fault it was, and all the rest of it. But that's the quote from one of the papers they published, and the link. It's worth having a look at. I won't bother to read it out now. Only one of these really. This is from Patricia Espinosa, the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, and she said, "The promises are simply not good enough. Many nations are sticking to their business as usual approach. Governments can go back and look very, very carefully at what they're able to offer. It's incredible to think that just when nations are facing an emergency that could eventually end all human life on this planet, we are wandering into a minefield blindfolded, where the next step could meet disaster." And there are any number of statements of that nature coming from people of that position and caliber. Here's the model. Now, before we actually animate it, if I just say that budgets also in the, we'll call it the southwest quadrant, carbon concentrations will rise in response to those in the northwest quadrant. Temperature will respond to concentrations here in the northeast quadrant, allowing for an essentially one-to-one relationship between concentrations and temperature as shown, but also the big unknown, the extent of the feedback effect, which is very difficult to measure. Feedback are now net positive. To what extent remains something to discover, but it's higher. And finally, in the southeast quarter, 3%, but you subtract damages at a rate quoted at COP6 by the insurance industry, where insured losses were going at 3%, but uninsured losses, they said, were going at another 3%, so 6% in total. If you start subtracting damages from growth, you get this configuration, which you'll see in a minute. Here we go. It's a lot to take in, but this is worth bearing in mind as you see it all working together. This side is renewable energies alternatives. That's oil, coal, and gas coming up there. There's a well-tempered climate accord at 2025, the NGOs say there. The medics say 2040, but you can see you're really starting to affect these curves now. And the temperature with and without the feedbacks is rising there. The whole argument is we've got to do it, but we've got to do it in time. So here, if you run it backwards, is renewables replacing fossil fuel consumption at a rate which forces them out of the game. There are probably nicer ways of putting it, but that's it. The overall pattern is very clear what's happening here. Obviously, the world isn't quite as deterministic as this in the real sense, but in terms of the policy response to it, the last thing we need to be is vague at this point. And it's not a laughing matter, but I don't know what else to do, to be honest. Let's see if we can, there it goes, it's still going. I don't want to do that again. Where's this damn mouse? And we get past this. Keep losing the mouse. There we are. This is the Rajan so-called global carbon incentive, simply how to finance it. Take equal entitlements per capita along with pro rata actual emissions simultaneously down to zero, effectively transferring between overconsumers and underconsumers as defined by the global per capita average against a price curve defined here. And in principle, it all in technical language, commutes. It adds up to exactly what it says it's going to do. There's no maybes and probabilities and blurring about it. And we can do that once again with the renewables being demonstrated, just to bring home that point fairly strongly. So the carbon incentive fund is operating exactly the same, only as the budget diminishes, the renewables come on stream at that proportionate rate simply to replace present consumption by those means. It may be possible to do better. It may be that there are better technologies coming on. Maybe they're going to get fission up and running, fusion, I beg your pardon, but that's still quite a long way off. Right, so that's enough of that. I'm going to try and get to... Now, here's an entirely different way of looking at the whole issue. This is from my perspective, where the unit of measure is a musical unit, not a monetary unit. This is what the well-tempered climate proposal has been based on. The measurement unit is known as the numeraire. There's a hero of us all. He was a cold warrior. He was a quantum physicist. He worked on the Manhattan Project. And he was involved in all of that during those years, but he ended up at the end of his life saying, behind all of this is an idea so simple, so beautiful, that when we grasp it in a decade, a century, or a millennium, we will all say to each other, how could it have been otherwise? How could we have been so stupid? So simple is best. Frank Wilczek, a very well-known Nobel Prize-winning cosmologist, physicist, said, atoms are musical instruments. I profoundly agree, but I go beyond that and say the universe itself is a musical instrument, and here's why. The monetary question, the numeraire question, is at play now, simply asking this question: are we simply trying to extend our world of monetary disorder into the full feedback reality of a musical universe? There's no question about who's going to lose that fight if we are. Here's the structure of the harmonic series, and there's going to be a switch over to playing this, I believe. And before I start this, there's the same overtone series. As a violinist, this is very familiar to people who play string instruments. There's one whole length at a constant tension. Here are 2 halves of it, here are 3/3 of it, 4/4 of it, and so on. And this gives you the harmonic series. And whether you believe in God or not isn't important, but this is certainly what the French call force majeure, because it is actually, at the very least, a so-called major chord in music. It's part of the providential equity that comes, for whatever reason that it does, it comes this way. So here's how there's a much deeper relationship between the harmonic series and this phi curve and fundamental cosmological values. There's the phi curve. That's a Taoist symbol. It's one of the most ancient in the universe. Gives us the hemiola, 1 against 2 against 3. Here comes the phi curve. Plotted as golden section components, it comes to that. And you'll get an enlarged version of that there for a moment. This is quite incredible, because on the axes of time, which is horizontal, and on space, which is vertical, in other words, time, space, the phi point is exactly at the meeting point of space and time. That's simply what it is. Going on, here's the one that really takes my breath away, at least. Pi is a, let's just stop that a moment. Pi is a transcendental number, meaning there is no way of computing it. you have to discover it. They're finding it out to the billionth decimal point now, but there's no algorithm that'll produce it. Phi, on the other hand, is a completely irrational number, but there is a way of computing it. But as this curve shows, there's also a way of deriving it in time space. And the final one is the alpha, the so-called fine structure constant. When you actually do the angles of this, it's very clear in what comes how these actually are in the same integrated package in a phi relationship. There it is. Alpha comes up at 137.05, and then they argue about the decimals. That's the one that where Pauli, the most famous physicist associated with this, said, if I get one shot at the pearly gates of asking a question, I'll say, God, why 137? His long relationship with Jung was all about that. Phi is at 137.75 here. That's the irrational number. The transcendental pi is at 137.5, but the whole thing is in a pi relationship, a phi defined relationship. It's an extraordinary degree of commutativity. It all adds up. Doesn't matter whether you call it rational, irrational, or transcendental. There it actually is. And so you get your Tao with alpha, pi, and phi, all conjugated that way in a natural endowment of force majeure. And you simply say, what's not to love? And you say, well, what's this got to do with this debate? A well-tempered climate accord has this underlying it. Well-temperedness comes from that very process. We can unpack that more, but we don't need to do that now. The golden angle gives you the organic growth. The current political lesson is this actually is leveling up while slowing down. I think it's more auspicious to talk about organic growth than negative growth and degrowth and all this sort of anti-growth arguments. After all, we are a product of growth, a product of organic growth. We're not, obviously, most of us, a product of exponential or monetary growth. So this is another way of finding consensus. And this is the final thing about the correspondences between this curve, the negative entropy curve, and first of all, the so-called Benford law curve. It's an extraordinary correspondence. You've probably never heard of Benford. I hadn't either until about a month ago. They literally polled which of the basic integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are used most often. 1 was most often, 2 was the next, 3, and so on. That's exactly the harmonic series. Well, you say, well, what's that got to do with anything? Benford law is little known, but widely used in fraud detection and has been for years. There's a long history of criminal agencies using that. But here's the one that really blew my head away. You've probably heard of LIGO, the Laser Interferometry Observatory. Was set up in the States, 2 of them, one on the west, one on the right, on the east side of the US, to detect not the sight of, but the sound of the universe. Within a day, they'd both recorded the same event, which was the collision of 2 black holes, and they published this curve. And it's a perfect fit. And I thought, as a musician, I don't need corroborating evidence, but that's quite a nice piece of it. And the final thing is simply to say this, that to have hope, we must exist. As I see it, hope exists because the harmonic series exists. It is, after all, force majeure and the numeraire of the hopes of all of our existence. If it wasn't true, we wouldn't be here. That's essentially the end of it. Thank you. Did I fit in the 20 minutes?
You did indeed, Aubrey. Fascinating. As I warned you, there were some intensive slides there, but absolutely fascinating to go back and have a look at. I think the great.
You want, well, whatever, yes. I mean, however people.
Yes. We'll be looking at it later. A couple of questions have come in. I think some fairly fundamentals, Aubrey, to come to you. Music is the most successful basis for precise. We're having a technical things just to get some. I'm going to keep coming with the questions. but I have to make sure that Aubrey can hear them. Otherwise, it's not much point me trying to answer the questions, particularly on precise music. My piano playing is not nearly up to anything like Aubrey's violin. Music is the most successful basis of precise, time-critical human collaboration because it depends on non-negotiable ratios of pitch and time. A score and performance by musicians can play accurately. So the question here is then, what key lessons does music offer politicians and UN negotiators when it comes to preventing climate chaos? And if you can answer that in 3 words, Aubrey, please. No.
The first rule of learning the violin is very simple. You learn it because it doesn't learn you. It's non-negotiable. And it's actually beautiful and you love it and it creates a life and so much more. So the politicians have the difficulty of creating more and more noise, as you saw in one of those early charts. While the problem got worse and worse, we pretended we were doing very well. We obviously weren't. So to put all of this on a shared hymn sheet, it would be very useful, for example, if all the corporate sponsors of this looked at it, considered it, and then put themselves in the position of collectively answering the question, how do we get everybody onto the same hymn sheet? Not rather push the concerns of our sector, be it poor versus rich, left versus right, men versus women, the abuse goes on without end. It's all noise. We want a signal, and we don't want a signal that is about the problem. We want a signal about how to solve it. So the Well-Tempered Climate Accord and the musical numeraire is helpful to bring that consensus about. Sorry, more than 3 minutes.
I was being facetious on that. I have to say the conversation here before and after is fascinating with Aubrey. Much appreciate the intellect you bring to it. Now, you mentioned well-tempered system, and to somebody who's a musical novice as myself, can you explain a bit more about what you mean by well-tempered in musical terminology? Now, you explained to me this allows it, the framework that allows you can go at any speed, but the framework's rigid at whatever speed you want to go to. Is that right?
That's certainly a key part of it. The reason why this exists is because by about 1710, 1720, the church had a long play in making beautiful music, church music. And the organ was hugely involved in that. And basically an organ means that every single note has to have a huge pipe engineered to produce precisely the pitch which the note is going to play. Similarly with keyboard instruments like the harpsichord. Every string has to be pre-tuned so that you can then have a player come and play the keyboard and make music. What Bach realized was not that well-tempering was necessary. People were trying it. What was needed was a Bible of explanation. He wrote a historic piece of music called the Well-Tempered Harpsichord. And it simply took this procedure of making all the 12 semitones in the octave equal. If you think of a piano keyboard, you've got 7 white notes and another 5 black notes. The intervals between them are tuned to be precisely equal. It actually means the fifth. The octave is always a perfect doubling. The fifth is a perfect trebling. But they're actually slightly contracted, well-tempered, to make the whole thing work in a way where you can play any music in any of the 12 available keys, and the model works. And the success of this model was incredible. The outflowering of music all over the world, starting in Europe, since that time has been unstoppable. The only time it starts breaking down is when the composers become more enamored of making noise rather than following signal. That goes on. That's in a way a separate debate. It gives an organizing signal to everybody. It's how orchestras are able to play in time and tune and together and deliver a success story every time they do it. And the last point I'll say is, you remember George Shelton, he's dead now. He gave the first performance of his World Orchestra for Peace at Buckingham Palace. And soloists from all the world's best orchestras came and gave their service to play in this orchestra, which was considered a great honor under his direction. And they played a program, I forget what it was now, and the people in the audience, essentially blue bloods and a lot of bling, they said, They clapped wildly. They loved it. People generally do. And he stopped them and he said, you know, Your Majesty, and so on, please tell me, why is it that musicians are able every time to do this perfectly and get this kind of a reaction? But every time politicians get involved, they ruin everything. And they were crazy. They loved it. So I'm not saying that the world is going to perform like an orchestra, but it's a good working model of consensus built on harmonic principles that are not imposed by anybody other than God himself, if you choose to believe it that way, or by providence, if you care to receive it that way, or by force majeure, if you prefer to phrase it atheistically. That the description, in a way, is immaterial. The key point is the question Leibniz posed 2 centuries or more ago: how is it we can go from nothing to something? What explains that? That's the key transition. Nothing to something. Something is involved. That's what it is. Where it comes from, that's another question. It exists.
It's more fundamentals about energy rather than just trying to maintain the temperature of the world here. So when we're looking at the systems that do you see the answer has to be musical, and we have to have a system that's equitable and comes down on the curve to get it to zero? Because if we don't, we get into politician-inspired feedback loop that just gets into noise. Is that what we've got to look for?
That's a pretty good way of summarizing. I mean, it's not that that's going to happen. That's what's been happening. And very largely, it's because you've got a contradictory meaning of equity between social equity, all the people who are socially disadvantaged by what's ever happening, as distinct from financial equity, where essentially the financial sector has been ploughing ahead with what has become expansion and divergence between the two. It's crudely more and more money attached to less and less people, with less and less people attached to less and less money attached to more and more people. It pulls like that. How do we bring that back together? That contradiction has to be addressed. We can't simply acknowledge it. We need to find a way of integrating this. In other words, leveling up while slowing down is a deep process, and we're critically in need of resolving it. We need not just an intent, we actually need a plan where people can share the same basis and agree that our globally common interests are pooled in doing what needs now to be done. The private sector will have a huge role in this, but they won't lead it. No institution will. An idea or a constitution, musical constitution will. Otherwise, I don't think we can solve it.
So we're looking for the George Schultz conductor at COP26 and the composer to put the music together. That 25,000 are going to come up with a tune in Glasgow next week. So looking to Glasgow and COP, you've clearly been involved with COPs going way back before they probably coined the name, which you're about to go to, the COP3. Do you see a coming together? Obviously, the noise, and we see the graphs you put up, the figures are not great. The results are there for playing. But do you see, is there hope in people coming together? Is there recognition? Then you see the people, the delegates at COP. Are you optimistic of them being unified or not?
Pablo Casals was 90 and somebody went up to him and said, "Pablo, you're 90. Why are you still practicing?" And he said, "I am making progress." It's a lovely, and he did eventually play at the UN. The point here is we have more consensus around CNC between COP2 and COP3 than we've had since the Climate Act, which was based on it, came out in 2008, 2009. And it's largely because the mixture of constituencies are basically at each other's throats and arguing so vigorously their side of the argument. There's no common position that's emerged. So in that sense, the danger now is not the lack of hope, it's the presence of false hope. And the false hope isn't about the fact that we may not solve it. The false hope is that we will solve it without a plan. That is not going to happen.
No. I should add, if any questions, keep questions coming in. Another one here. So in terms of COP, what would success be for COP26 for you?
I think it's inevitable it's going to end up with a noisy outcome that they'll describe as progress, just like they did about Paris. And after that, the level of anxiety is going to go up considerably more than is already the case now. At that point, the protests and the arguments and so on are going to intensify. I'm really worried about that. It's not just what happens on the streets outside the Bank of England, pretty Fattail sending all these new jails and all of that. It's the arguments between the US and China. John Kerry was very frank about this. What he said was, it depends, absolutely, the whole thing depends on a cooperative agreement between the US and China. The mad thing is, we had that, specifically the US and China, India, the Africa Group and others, at COP3. They all agreed that contraction and convergence was necessary, in now Mike Manelli's terms, specifically if we were going to involve the trading of these entitlements to emit. They all argued that. And I can tell you this, that Joe Biden and John Kerry were both signatories to the Byrd-Hagel resolution, a bipartisan full majority acceptance of it before COP3. And the position was presented as the US will not sign up to anything that isn't global. And they specified that what in effect was CNC was the only way to do it. We got agreement between all those parties at that time. Since that period, in the first decade thereafter, agreement grew relentlessly about the acceptance of the model. The attempts to approve it were just attempts to make it more complicated. But after 2010, for reasons that have never been clear to me, a new form of noise entered into the debate. It was called scientific probability. And a whole new set of arguments was deployed in order to, apparently, if you believe the BBC, was an attempt to prove that CNC was just a mantra that had nothing to do with the science. You then look at what they actually have done with the science since then and failed to do. And CNC, in the words of many, is still fundamentally unchallenged. And in the words of many others, fundamentally unchallengeable. It's so simple, it's so direct, it's so unifying. It has such a successful history in music. It's such a critical moment for us to get beyond what comes after COP26 in terms of increased anxiety, to come to order. One of the points in that slide animation was, the governments all want to achieve, they say, or some of them want to achieve net zero by 2050. It's too little too late. XR, protesting very effectively all over the streets, wants zero emissions globally by 2030. The difficulty is it's too much too late. There's no chance of the world reducing at 10% per annum for 10 years to achieve that, especially if they don't want any governments to be involved. The doctors want to try and do it by 2040 and got every medical journal in the world to publish an editorial about a fortnight ago saying they wanted 2040 as a zero date based on CNC principles. I'm not saying it's going to work, but those three positions are contrasted. That is where the new battleground is going to be. How much, how soon, and how do you put it all together in time? This gives you a route.
Yes, so we're not looking to COP26, we look beyond. An interesting question from Stephen Salmon, who I presume you know. Thank you to my friend Aubrey. Question, if you please. When can we expect to see some sort of global ecological event that gains the attention of the human species at the same moment in space-time? How will this global kick in the rump of the human species occur? That is to ask Aubrey, what might this global ecological event at some unknown future point in time look like?
Well, it's a lovely question, and Steve and the rest of us all know the actual ecological event doesn't happen specifically and everywhere at one moment. You get this scattered effect with the Rossby waves. It's very cold low down and very hot high up, and it's moving. It's more and more uncertain. It's less and less structured and less predictable. And in respect of the ice melt in the Arctic, if it goes on at the rate it's going, and we get a so-called blue ocean event, no ice in the Arctic within the next 5 to 10 years maximum, it might even be sooner, the knock-on effects are going to be huge. They won't be evenly distributed, but to coin a phrase from the Bible, God's rain falls on the just and the unjust equally. And in a way, it's going to be supremely unfair to everybody. because we'll all have taken some version of the hit, and we're all going to, in effect, share some form of the blame for having failed to really capitalize on this way of organizing, which we should have done and could have done 30 years ago.
It's a sad fact of human existence that the positive things don't tend to push us forward as much as the negative things. And it takes a real sharp shock generally to change behavior, more so than the positive everyday message we're given. And one worries of what that short, sharp shock, or it might be a long, sharp shock, we don't know, might look like. Another question from Lassie, what sort of language do you think will be needed to hammer through the message to decision makers? Your numbers make a strong argument that the economy would be best served by taking global warming seriously, yet they seem to hide behind short-term economic gains like deer in the headlights.
That's absolutely true. The answer to that very simply is, if you look at the way the insurance industry is reacting to all of this, bear in mind they make their money out of insuring buildings and all the rest of it because it's assumed they're going to go on working or they're going to go on being there. Houses that are too near the cliff in Norfolk and either already falling into the water or soon to go that way, they can't get insurance. It's as simple as that. That is spreading. In crude language, capitalism doesn't work without insurance. That's an extent of threat we don't need to invoke in order to have this long, hard shock of realizing the problem is insoluble because it's all too late. We need to act with urgency in a coordinated way. And in that sense, the integration, the triple bottom line, all the rest of this sort of language that's used in the corporate sector now is obviously moving in that direction. But the key thing you saw in the graphic is the necessity of the financial sector uniting, not competing, but uniting to, as Carney says, the government should do, force fossil fuel consumption out of the economy. If nothing else, that would be massively a step in the right direction. The next thing is to realize you can't service an infinite energy demand curve, whatever the source of supply is. So a slowing down overall, a leveling out as well as a leveling up, if you will, needs to occur. And the corporate sector, they're not stupid people. They know all of this. And they don't want to be sent into a phony war to finish us all off and pretend that it was all worth it. It obviously isn't. So please, you guys, share this hymn sheet amongst yourselves and with everybody else and encourage the idea that you're not going to lead it, you're going to massively feed it with the right behavior in effectively a globally coordinated effort which can only come from governments and effectively from the Security Council, at the apex of which it's that the US and China stop hurling insults at each other and come to cooperative terms of agreement. Not a contest between capitalism and communism. Those are relatively gossipy details next to the enormity of what it is that we have to achieve.
And that, I think, as we approach the time, seems a very auspicious way to end, Aubrey. Thank you very much indeed. So we now look, as we go forward, firstly, thanks to our sponsors. These people, as Aubrey says, we hope will be helping to fund not just these webinars, but to move forward to a decarbonised world. Secondly, to you, the audience, for your attention and questions. I should note that this wide-ranging webinar series continues tomorrow with the US-timed webinar on global security challenges, existential threats and geopolitics. We might have covered some of that already today. And then next week, she's discussing how we talk about how we work, looking at impact of AI and skills taxonomy on Tuesday morning. And on Wednesday afternoon, accounting standards and the discount rates in defined benefit pension schemes evaluation, the contractual accrual rate. That'll be a specialist one there. And then in 2 weeks, where have all the 300,000 plus jobs gone? But before that, I must say goodbye, and our final thanks to you, Aubrey, for your time and insight this afternoon. And it's goodbye to now.